Welcome to Shepherd and Wedderburn's webinar on the impact of euphoria and hope in negotiations. This is the third in a series of webinars which explore the role emotions play throughout the negotiation. My name is Alex Roobottom. I'm an associate in the commercial disputes team at Shepherd and Wedderburn. My practice primarily involves property and telecoms disputes of all flavours. Whilst my practice on the face of it doesn't sound as though it lends itself to feelings of hope or euphoria, I have seen the power that hope can have in disputes when deployed effectively.
I'm Ruairidh Leishman, a senior associate in the commercial disputes team. Much like Alex, I'm all too aware of the impact that emotions can have on commercial outcomes. Unlike the previous emotions explored in this webinar series, hope and euphoria are typically emotions we want to feel. Negotiations entered into with feelings of hope and euphoria are in many ways similar to going on a first date. In both cases, you're taking yourself outside of your comfort zone with the hope of finding a connection. Going on a first date in a state of anxiety or anger are unlikely to promote that initial connection, and the same applies in many negotiations.
A number of years ago, I was at a mediation. The proceedings had been hard fought up until that point, with my clients feeling entirely disenchanted with the process. Mediation was the first point at which they dared to hope that the dispute would come to an end, and they would walk away with some cash in their pockets. In the end, they were right. 12 hours and 30 cups of coffee, for me at least. We had a deal. Our client was by no means grinning like an oaf throughout those 12 hours, but one of the most profound effects of hope/euphoria is a willingness to be more pragmatic in order to achieve the outcome you desire.
Today, we will be considering the impact of the positive emotions and how euphoria and hope can help or indeed hinder your commercial negotiations.
So, without further ado, why do positive emotions matter in negotiations? Well, as humans, we are all subject to the impact of our own emotions and the emotions of those around us. Pretending they don't exist is simply not an option and won't get you very far in negotiations. How many times have you been in a room and the atmosphere has been drained by the wrong person walking in being in a terrible mood? Be they your boss, spouse, or even a fellow negotiator? Maybe I'm just incredibly petty. I am a disputes lawyer after all. But the effect of someone else's terrible mood on me is usually that I match it. Not exactly conducive to a positive outcome.
When many people think of a negotiation, and indeed disputes, they assume that there will be a winner and a loser. This zero-sum game mindset is not conducive to a successful negotiation. At its most basic, a negotiation is two or more parties seeking to reach an agreement that is satisfactory to both sides. That doesn't automatically mean that there is a winner and a loser. It really is as simple as that.
When viewed as a consensual process, negotiations have much more room to allow positive emotions to flourish. Research shows that negotiators who are able to create a positive atmosphere around the negotiating table are more likely to achieve a favourable outcome. This can even be as simple as smiling and promoting open body language. As much as I am loath to give white van men any credit, when they shout, "Smile love, it might never happen," they could be onto something.
Of course, the reality is that many negotiators want to maintain a facade of neutrality, particularly at the commencement of negotiations. Who does this help? No one. As I said at the beginning, a successful negotiation is all about finding a connection with your fellow negotiator. We will take you through the practical implications of hope and euphoria in the context of negotiations and provide you with some practical tips on how these can enhance your effectiveness in negotiating. The psychological research shows us that euphoria and hope are the cornerstones of building trust. And we all know that trust is key in negotiations. You have to trust that your fellow negotiator wants to do a deal, that they are doing the best deal that they can, and ultimately that they will follow through with the deal. Now turning to the research. For those of you who are tuned into our last webinar in the series on the effects of anger in a negotiation, you will remember that several studies have shown that parties to a negotiation who display anger can often elicit more from their opponents in certain situations. However, it was consistently found that when people negotiated with happy opponents, they reported a more positive experience and a better long-term relationship with them. It goes without saying that this can be much more valuable over the long run. So, if there's a need to maintain a strong relationship, and you're not just in it for a short-term gain, displaying more positive emotions of happiness and hope can have a much more beneficial outcome for you and the other side.
Imagine two negotiators sitting down to the negotiating table. One is quietly upbeat, optimistic, smiling, and the other is visibly angry, fizzing, burrowing their brow, and using sharp, snappy language. We're going to focus on the happy party to the negotiation. Does being more optimistic get you a better deal, or does it trick you into making worse decisions? We're going to go through a few studies and draw out some of the key findings that support why you should prioritise going into your next negotiation with a more positive mindset.
Now let's take a look at the effects of emotional expressions in negotiations. Considerable amounts of research have been undertaken by psychologists, and in particular, I'd like to share the findings of a 2020 paper written by Sharma, Elfenbein, Sinha and Bottom, in which they put together a meta-analysis of 64 different studies on emotional expressions. The headline is that when it comes to negotiation, emotions matter. However, the effects depend heavily on which emotion, how it's shown, and the negotiation context. As a brief summary, negatively expressed emotions like anger or frustration generally increase concessions from the other side. This is because these emotions infer limits of toughness and a firmer stance. However, this often comes at the cost of reduced trust or cooperation, especially if the emotions don't appear genuine.
On the other hand, positively expressed positive emotions often increase cooperation potential and can improve relationships and joint outcomes. The effects are not uniform though, and they depend on things like whether the emotions are genuine or strategic, whether negotiation is distributive or integrative, and who controls the framing. In short, positive effect is often helpful for cooperation and rapport, but it does not automatically translate into better individual economic outcomes. The authors of this meta-analysis anchor these findings in the emotions as social information theory, or the EASY theory, which was developed by the psychological researcher Gerben van Cleef. This theory provides that emotional displays influence negotiation through inferences and affective reactions in their counterpart. This analysis highlights the fact that displaying positive emotions during a negotiation doesn't just make for a more satisfactory interaction for both parties, but that they systematically shape how negotiators read each other and how they respond.
So, our next experiment looks at the influence of positive affect and visual access on the discovery of integrative solutions in bilateral negotiation. Now, on the face of it, this experiment does sound quite jargon-heavy and impenetrable, but it is actually a key experiment on the affect of positive emotions in negotiations. In the experiment, conducted by Peter J. Carnival and Alice Inson in 1986, the researchers created two groups: the positive affect group and the neutral or controlled group. In the positive group, participants were, without their knowledge, given special treatment, attempting to put them in a good mood using small positive emotion induction. They received a small gift, a notebook, or were requested to go through some funny comic strips from the New Yorker. In the neutral group, participants received no induction. The groups were then paired up and given a negotiation task where, importantly, trade-offs were a possibility. Each negotiator was given a payoff chart showing what each issue was worth to them and how much they gained or lost depending on settlement choices. Since the schedules differed between partners, win-win outcomes existed, but importantly, only if negotiators explored, communicated, and problem-solved. After the pairs were given the chance to negotiate under a set time limit, they observed how many integrative trades they discovered, whether they made concessions, how the tone of the negotiation shifted, and the quality of the final agreement.
What was found was that positive affect negotiators reached more integrative agreements, meaning that they discovered trade-offs more easily and created higher joint gains. They also exchanged information more openly, were more cooperative, and less adversarial. They were also more generous in generating solutions, as it was concluded that the positive effect increased cognitive flexibility. Finally, displays of aggression and competitive behaviour decrease compared to the neutral groups.
Carnival conducted a further study on positive affect and decision frame in 2007. Decision frame is essentially how an outcome is viewed. A positive decision frame would be, yay, we've won, I'm really pleased with that outcome. Whilst a negative decision frame would be more akin to, we've given up quite a lot to get here and I'm not particularly pleased about that. This experiment tested whether positive affect changes how negotiators respond to decision frames, which refers to whether outcomes are described as gains or losses in a negotiation context. Again, there were two groups, the neutral and the positive group. It was found that the neutral negotiators were less willing to make concessions when outcomes were framed as losses than when they were framed as gains. And for the positive condition participants, where the framing reverses, the happy negotiators made more concessions under a loss frame than under a gain frame.
The study found that normally people are more conservative under a loss frame, meaning that they concede less than under a gain frame, but positive affect can shift this pattern. In some studies, it even reverses the usual frame effect. In other words, when you're in a positive mood, your sensitivity to gain and loss framing changes. You may become more open to trade-offs or more willing to create value, but you can also be more willing to accept risky or seemingly generous options if the frame and mood align. That interaction is important, as the same optimistic mood that pushes you to be creative and collaborative can also make you respond differently to framed offers, sometimes to your advantage and sometimes not. By way of example, I've been in a mediation when my client had a strong claim and our opponent had a strong counterclaim. The claim and the counterclaims were of a similar value. At the mediation, there was an offer that both parties walk away. By the time we'd arrived at this point in the mediation, our client was unable to frame the walkaway in a positive decision frame. They could only see that they would be losing their claim and not getting the benefit of not having to deal with their counterclaim, which was also of a significant value, or not having to progress their claim to trial. Ultimately, there was no settlement, and the matter went to trial anyway. Had our client been able to reframe their thinking and viewed the walkaway as a positive rather than a negative, they would have saved themselves considerable sums of money and stress. A cautionary tale.
What is the impact of positive emotions in bilateral negotiations? A 2022 pilot study used loving-kindness meditation to induce positive emotions in pairs and looked at a range of negotiation outcomes. Now that may sound a little bit hippie to the hardcore negotiators in our audience, but the effects of loving-kindness meditation in a negotiation context make it worth putting aside apprehensions. The study compared 3 conditions where 1. Both parties received a positive emotion induction, 2. Only one party received the induction, and 3. Where no emotion induction was given, being the control group.
It then examined how positive emotion relates to key negotiation variables such as cooperation potential, willingness to exit the negotiation, time to reach an agreement, first offers, aspirations and expectations, individual gains and joint gains. The clearest findings were that when negotiators were positive, either both or one of them, they showed greater cooperation potential, and participants were less likely to choose to exit the negotiation, and the negotiations tended to take less time. But importantly, the study did not find reliable effects of positive mood on several economic markers such as first offers, aspirations, individual gains, or joint gains. Put plainly, positivity helped people stay engaged and work together and sped things up, but it didn't automatically produce higher monetary gains for either side in that pilot. That pattern emphasises how positive mood can change process, time, willingness to cooperate without automatically changing price. Finally, on a slight shift from the more scientific studies, a core insight considered in an essay called Aspirations and Negotiations from the Marquette Law Review in 2004 by Andrea Kupfer-Schneider is that negotiators who set higher aspiration levels generally achieve better outcomes, so being more hopeful than going into the negotiation can be really beneficial. The author argues that aspirations, being the goal negotiators set above their bottom line, are a central but underemphasised feature of effective bargaining. She points out that while negotiation training focuses heavily on BATNA being a best alternative to a negotiated agreement and reservation prices, it often leaves out aspiration level being the positive, optimistic goal negotiators aim for.
This paper is not a big experimental study with statistics, but it's more of a conceptual and theoretical essay that draws on existing findings in negotiation theory to highlight several key points. The first is that aspirations should be optimistic, not just realist. Negotiators with higher aspirations achieve better results because they push themselves to negotiate harder, stay patient, and think strategically to reach that goal rather than settle early. The second is that aspirations must be justifiable. If they're grounded in objective criteria, market standards, evidence, clear logic, they give the negotiator credibility and persuasion power. Unjustified aspirations can look unrealistic and weaken persuasion. The third is that specific and optimistic goals help negotiators avoid complacency. Just simply saying, "I'll do my best" is vague and low impact, but setting a specific target frames the entire negotiation around what's possible.
Finally, it considers why negotiators often don't set high aspirations. The reason being that they often fear disappointment, have a lack of information when preparing, or a desire to avoid conflict that can suppress aspiration setting. As a disputes lawyer, I've never personally experienced a desire to avoid conflict, but understandably, many people do. However, the evidence points to the idea that the higher goals often lead to better outcomes. This connects to happiness and euphoria in that positive effects tend to elevate hopes and expectations, which can be good as it pushes you to ask for more and to persist, but it's a risky approach if your targets become too detached from reality. So, if euphoria lifts your aspirations, translate that uplift into concrete evidence-backed targets rather than vague optimism.
From these papers and research, we've summarised a set of practical, evidence-based tendencies. Euphoria boosts cooperation and relationship outcomes. Positive affect reliably increases cooperative behaviours and reduces the desire to exit, which will help integrative problem solving and preserves working relationships. It speeds up the process. Positive moods often shorten negotiation time because people are more willing to explore and reach agreement. But bear in mind that faster does not always mean better in terms of your objective gains. It raises aspirations. This can be a good thing if it's disciplined. Optimistic goals drive better performance, but they must be defensible. Otherwise, optimism becomes overreaching and your opponent will be frustrated with your unrealistic demands. It interacts with cognitive frames and context. The beneficial effects of positive mood are moderated by things like whether the negotiation is framed as gains or losses, whether outcomes are distributive or integrative, and whether emotional displays are seen as sincere or manipulative. It doesn't guarantee more money. Several studies, such as the pilot, failed to find robust effects of positive mood on economic gains or higher first offers. It found that the improvements are often in the process of the negotiation itself and bolstering relationships rather than financial payoffs. So you need to balance what your main objectives are.
We are already aware that the negative emotions such as anger signal toughness, raise demands, but also tend to reduce trust and damage long-term relationships. The meta-analysis study we considered earlier shows that negative emotions tend to reduce subjective satisfaction and trust. Plus, it often also reduces the benefit of the joint outcomes when they shut down integrative behaviour. On the other hand, positive effect tends to increase cooperation and relationship outcomes, but doesn't automatically extract better distributional economics. So anger can win a short-term concession or scare the other side into conceding, while more positive emotions like euphoria and hope tend to open the table for more mutual exploration. However, it may not result in you making more financially favourable gains. It's easy for us to explain why more euphoric or happier parties to a negotiation can get more favourable outcomes. But what does that actually mean practically? And what can you take away from this to actually use in your next negotiation? I suppose the first thing you want to work out is, how can you boost your mood before a negotiation? It's not the gut feeling most of us experience when we feel pressure to get what we need from our opponent. We've come up with a few evidence-based techniques that you can use. Firstly, give yourself a small micro-boost. Carnival's experiments used a small, positive inductions to boost participants' mood. So when you want to pick me up before a stressful negotiation, listen to an upbeat song, watch a funny clip, eat something you enjoy, or treat yourself to that expensive coffee, minus a flat white for those of you who remain interested, or try to recall a positive memory. It might seem small, but the experiments show they do work to set you up for a positive mindset. Take a moment for a breathing or mindfulness exercise. The 2022 Loving Kindness Meditation to increase positive emotions and reduce negativity. It boosts your cooperation and reduces negotiation exit rates. Take a few minutes by yourself, try to stay grounded and breathe slowly. Thirdly, choose the right environment. This might not always be within your control, but small environmental tweaks like having space with natural light and limited distractions can increase your mood. Lastly, avoid stress triggers where possible. Maybe just one coffee after all. Again, this isn't always possible, but if you can avoid reading emails, rushing, or trying to multitask before you go into the negotiation.
The next thing to work out is how to use your newfound good mood in a practical way. Positivity can help the process, but it doesn't automatically improve the deal. You still need to be strategic. The skill is using Euphoria to build cooperation and creativity while keeping analysis and decision-making on the colder side. Use your positive move to open the conversation. The positive effect is most useful at the beginning of the meeting rather than at the end because the other parties are forming their impressions. Greet them warmly, set a collaborative tone, and try to signal that you're solutions-focused and trying to get the deal done. Number 2, be mindful of the framing trap. Positive effect can make negotiators respond differently to gain-loss framing. When you're feeling good, you might become more open to concession under a loss frame or be more likely to take risks that feel fine but aren't the best objectively. So make sure to take time before you agree to anything to consider the numbers and terms. 3, balance your warmth and coldness. We know from the 2022 study that positive affect has relationship and speed benefits, but it doesn't always result in the best economic outcome. Make sure you're always snapping back your desired goals and aspirations and getting what you want. 4, don't be over the top. Being too euphoric can be dangerous too. If the other side thinks you're being false for strategy, they'll be less likely to be receptive to your good mood, and it could lead to them being less cooperative.
And that concludes our webinar on euphoria in the context of negotiations. Hopefully, you are now euphoric because of what you've learned, not because the webinar has ended.
Like anger, the strength of euphoria can be difficult to keep in check in negotiations, but it can be a powerful tool to build trust, and it can be key in developing longer-term relationships. Personally, I wonder whether it is something that can easily be controlled in negotiations though.
The next webinar in our series looks at greed. After this brief, and dare I say it, happy foray looking at positive emotions, we are back to considering negative ones.
In the meantime, we hope that you've enjoyed this webinar and that it has been useful. Thank you for watching.